The majority of us in the room, I'm just kind of making an assumption here, the majority of us in the room, we are Jesus followers. So if you are not a Jesus follower, but a friend invited you out or you're just joining us, we're happy that you're here. Hopefully you still feel at home, even if we don't share all the same beliefs. Tonight you're going to get an inside look at one of the things that we as Jesus followers believe is essential to holy living, which if you've been here in the spring, it's kind of the theme. It's the theme that we've been talking about. And that idea of holy living, it comes from a prayer. In the first century, a gentleman by the name of Paul of Tarsus, he wrote a letter to a church, which that church was located in what is now modern-day Greece. And the way he ended that letter was with this prayer. He said, "Now may the God of peace himself sanctify you completely, and may your whole spirit and soul and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ." The question that we're essentially trying to ask ourselves is, what does it look like for us as Jesus followers to become more sanctified, to become more healthy, more complete, more whole in our life, both spirit, soul, and body? But before we get into the passage for this evening, we're going to be in 1 Thessalonians 2. Before we get there, I want to start with a story. It was my 18th birthday, which is almost 10 years ago now. It was my 18th birthday, and I was a freshman in college at Cal State Long Beach. I had graduated. Oh, woo, yeah, alma mater, yeah. I guess there's like millions of us out there, right? Because the school's so big, it's not like prestigious. Anyways, my sister goes to like a really prestigious school, and like when I try to connect with her, I'm always like, yeah, well, when I was at Long Beach State, like it doesn't connect at all. I'm like trying to help. I'm getting off topic. Okay, it was my 18th birthday, and I was a freshman at Cal State Long Beach, and I had graduated in May or June of 2014. All right, so I graduated there, and then later that fall is when I started school. And then that November of my first semester at college, that's when I turned 18 years old. And I can remember that birthday fairly well because outside of my family and my girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife, outside of essentially my family and the dating relationship that I was in, on that day, I did not have one friend who sent me a happy birthday message. Like I said, I actually didn't mention this, but I had started following Jesus just about a year prior when I was a senior in high school. And because I was learning how to follow Jesus and everything was really brand new to me, I had made a decision to exit kind of a lot of the relationships that I had built up through most of high school. I was trying to get away from the partying scene, the drinking, the smoking, all of it. So when I recognized I needed to make some changes, I made a decision to distance myself from all the friends that I had put in work to develop those relationships over years. And looking back now, I definitely recognize I ended some of those friendships immaturely, but I did what I believed I had to do at that time. So I graduate high school and I essentially walk away from all of the closest relationships that I had, while simultaneously I was getting really involved here at Cottonwood. I was in love with Jesus. I was new to the faith. I was trying to develop better relationships and friendships. I had some acquaintances and some people who, I was kind of connected to. It's not like I didn't know anyone, but I didn't have great, close friendships. I didn't have anyone who really knew the real me. I didn't have anyone who knew me enough to know when my birthday was. I didn't have anyone who, it kind of felt like, oh, they were excited to see me, or they actually know what's going on in my life, or they really care about me. Socially, I was a bit lonely. And according to the data, I might have been in the majority. The Barna Group, their most recent data on young adults is from 2019, as far as I'm aware of. And in that report, they said this: just 1 in 3 young adults would say that they often feel deeply cared for by those around them, or that someone believes in them. A key conclusion from that report, their study on young adults nationally, was that despite being a hyper-connected and globally minded generation, many young adults today feel lonely. And like I mentioned a moment ago, my wife and I, we get to lead the teenagers of this church. So one of the things that we love to do when students graduate is within that first year, whether it's 3, 6, 12 months after they graduate, is we love to get some feedback and basically ask the question like, hey, now that you've graduated out of high school, now that you've graduated out of, our youth ministry here, like, what are some things that are difficult? What are some challenges that you're facing that you didn't anticipate or you felt like you weren't prepared for? It's one of the ways that we get feedback to try to consider how can we do a better job at continuing to disciple and equip the young people who we get to influence. And one of the pieces of feedback that we often get is, I didn't realize it was going to be this lonely. Like, if I don't really connect with my coworkers, if I don't really connect here at Young Adults with anyone, where do I make friends? Like real friends, people who I can trust, people who know the real me. It's obviously great to have social circles and environments. Some of us, we have a relatively good network of people who know us and people who we like. But even if you can walk into a space and know everyone in the room, we all still have a desire for someone to know us, like the real us. And what's fascinating to me about that is that most people who I know, and this is myself included, most people who I know who struggle with connecting to others on a deeper level, it's not because they're not trying. Like some of us, we have been trying to connect more with people for a while. We are at all the church gatherings. We are at all the social events. We go out to eat afterwards. We are connecting with people through social media. Like, it's not because we're not putting ourselves out there. It's not that we're not trying. It's just that it's not working. We're not connecting in the way that we desire. And that feeling of wanting to connect with others better and yet still feeling some sense of loneliness, some sense of no one knows the real me, this might not make you feel better right away, but that feeling, that is the opposite of what we find Paul describing in our passage tonight. The way Paul talks to this church in chapter 2 of this letter, it kind of makes me feel like I am sitting at a table with two best friends and I am watching them go back and forth with their inside jokes. And they're like, oh, because we've known each other forever, we understand all these things. And I'm just there reading like, this must be nice. But that's not what I have. Let me highlight a couple passages from chapter 2 of our letter. We'll throw them on the screen. Verse 7, he says, instead, we were like young children among you. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. Just think about that for a moment. Like, Anthony, you didn't have anyone who remembered your birthday. Paul says, we like spiritually nursed you. That's how close we were. And then he goes on, verse 12, for you know that we dealt with each of you as a father deals with his own children. And then the next verse 17, but brothers and sisters, when we were orphaned by being separated from you for a short time, in person, we weren't separated in thought, never that, out of our intense longing, we made every effort to see you. In other words, being separated from you guys, it was like a kid being separated from their parents. That's how connected we were. As Paul starts to move into the body of his letter in 1 Thessalonians, he wants to remind this church in so many ways, guys, I didn't see our time together as just one church that I started and then moved on. I really felt connected to you. And what I found particularly fascinating about Paul's word choice here is what he said in verse 8. We read it a moment ago. We'll isolate it on the screen. He says, so we cared for you because we loved you so much. We were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. Our lives as well. I think this is what so many of us want. People who we can be ourselves with, people who we can say we are sharing our life with them. And I think it's worth noting that, at least in my reading, this is a perfect example of what New Testament discipleship is. If you consider the fact that Jesus picked 12 disciples and kind of did life with them, he would have had more disciples outside of that group, but he had this inner core that he didn't just share information with or download teachings to, but he lived with them. He provided them with behind-the-scenes access on his life. And then Matthew 28, the Great Commission, when he would have told them, okay, guys, all authority has been given to me. Now you go and make disciples. They surely had in mind what they just experienced from him. Okay, we're supposed to go out, we're supposed to find people, at least as many as we can manage, and we are supposed to not just teach them things, but share our life with them. We are supposed to spend time with them and train them into disciples who can make other disciples. When I think of sharing my life with people, I think of this sustained commitment over time, which is why I find it fascinating that in Paul's language here, he says, we shared our lives with you. Because when he says that, he's actually referring to a period of about 3 weeks. And I know we've addressed this scene in previous weeks. Acts chapter 17, it tells the story of when Paul started a Jesus community in the city of Thessalonica, this church that he's writing to. And in that account, Paul was only there for a couple weeks. I'll show you the scene really fast. It says, now when they had traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And according to Paul's custom, he visited them, and for 3 Sabbaths, in other words, for 3 Saturdays, he reasoned with them from the scriptures. But the Jews, becoming jealous and taking along some wicked men from the marketplace, they formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. And as the scene progresses, the believers in the city, they recognize, hey, Paul, you are in danger because of this mob, because of this uproar. So they send Paul away at night, which means that the narrative tells us Paul showed up, he spent around 3 weeks there, and then he left. And then he has the audacity to write to this church and say, we were delighted to share our lives with you. And if I'm just being honest, I don't know if you can actually share your life with people in 3 weeks. If we had a guest preacher show up at Cottonwood and they taught for 3 successive weekends and then they left and we did not see them again, but they sent a letter and said, I am so glad to be sharing my life with you all. Like, thank you, but I'm calling that dramatic because I don't know if we actually shared our life together. And this is where a range of Bible translations can become very helpful for us in our study, because as I was trying to make sense of this, I noticed that many of the major translations will translate the underlying Greek here in various ways. So the version that we read says, we shared our lives with you. That's the NIV, the NASB, or the NLT. If you read the ESV or the NRSV translation, they translate the Greek word for psyche as we shared ourselves with you. So not just, hey, we shared like our lives and experiences, but we shared something of who we are. But the Lexham English Bible, along with the translators of the KJV, because of their translation philosophy, they translate the underlying Greek word here in verse 8 the same way that they translate it in chapter 5, verse 23. They say, we shared our souls with you. And if you were here to start the series, Pastor Sam defined the soul as the integrating center of who we are. In the creation account, Genesis 2, verse 7 says that when God formed the man from the dust of the earth, or he did so, he formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Some of the older translations actually translate that Hebrew word as the man became a living soul, because the idea is that the soul, or the life, the being of an individual, it includes both the breath of God and the dust of the earth. Our soul, it consists of things that we can see and things that we can't see. It consists of our mind, our emotions. It consists of our intelligence as well as our insecurity. Our soul consists of our talents and our temptations. Within our soul is the good, the bad, and the ugly of who we are. Which is why Paul, even though he was only around this community for a month, can confidently say, I shared my life with you because I shared my soul. Like, I wasn't fake. You guys know who I really am. Here's a couple examples of this. In verse 2 of chapter 2, he says, you all know how much we were suffering when we met. Like, I was going through a difficult time. In verses 9 and 10, he says, you all know how hard we worked when we were there. You know how holy and righteous and blameless we were. You know how we lived behind the scenes when I wasn't preaching and when people weren't listening to me. In the narrative in Acts chapter 17, it tells us that they all would have experienced a form of social pressure and persecution together, which is why Paul can say, I know we were only there for a little bit, but you guys all saw the unfiltered director's cut. Like, you actually saw me under pressure, and you saw me when I had peace. You saw me when I was full of faith, and you also saw me when I was afraid and anxious and worried. You heard me share my hopes and my dreams, but you also heard me share my struggles and my failures. We shared our souls. Our soul, it was meant to be shared. To say it another way, if we want to be the best version of ourselves, we need people who know the true version of ourselves. In their book, How People Grow, by Dr. Henry Cloud and John Townsend, both of them are clinical psychologists, they make the case in the book that people's most basic fundamental need in life is simply relationship and connection with others. Here's a quote from the book. They say that at the emotional level, connection is the sustaining factor for the psyche, the heart, and the spirit. Virtually every emotional and psychological problem, from addiction to depression, it has alienation or emotional isolation at its core or close to it. Recovery from these problems always involves helping people to get more connected to each other at deeper and healthier levels than they are. They go on, they say, ironically, one problem we often see in the Christian community is that people get more into religion and less into the connectedness that the Bible prescribes, with the result that they get sicker. For the same reason, many people feel disconnected from God because they have not been connected to his body. What does this have to do with our theme, holy living? I'll say it this way. There is no such thing as living holy and lonely. Now, to be clear, I don't mean that we can never feel lonely, right? That would be unrealistic. We do not have full control over our feelings or emotions all the time. But one definition of lonely is just without companions, or solitary, or existing alone. And there is no version of our lives where we are operating at our best while simultaneously existing alone, being disconnected from relationships where we can share our soul. This is obviously one of the reasons why CYA is set up the way that it is. This is why we sit at tables. This is why we do things like read together. Because in order to live holy, we can't live lonely. We need each other. We need friendships that allow us to show both our strength, but also our struggle. Or as Paul demonstrated, we need relationships where we can share our soul. If I were to just speak from my own experience, one of the reasons that I know I've struggled with connecting with friends in various seasons of my life is because I've just been too afraid to show my struggle or to show my weakness, my temptations. I can remember a couple years back, I was in therapy, and I think I'd been going to therapy for around a year at this point. And I was expressing to my therapist how I struggle with just being myself, and in particular with showing other people my weakness, showing other people my struggle. I am a 3 on the Enneagram, if that means anything to you. I have a high value for performance, and being a pastor just comes with a very unique set of expectations. So I was explaining to him how I feel like I need to be this, that, and the other in order for people to like me, love me, respect me, whatever it was. And I was afraid that if people found out who I really am, if people found out what part of the journey I'm really on, if people found out what I really thought, then no one would like me, maybe no one would love me. And I know that sounds deep, but I cried in his office on a regular basis, so he was accustomed to it. But as I'm explaining to him, like, man, if people just found out who I really am, if people knew what I did, I don't know if they would like me. I don't know if they would love me. As I'm explaining this to him, my man hit me with one of the coldest questions. He said, if you have to be someone else for people to like you, who is it that they like? Because it's not you. I gasped because I was like, this is why I pay you as much as I do. The financial sacrifice I have to make to sit in this office, this is it. This is why right here, because what he helped me understand is you can cover up your soul all you want. You can play pretend and you can try to get people to like a version of you, but don't expect people to love the real you if you never show them who you really are. Don't expect people to care about what you are carrying if you're never honest. See, when you think about your discipleship, when you think about giving your whole self over to God in order to be sanctified entirely, please do not underestimate the power of sitting with a friend and just being honest. Hey, you know what's really tempting me right now? Hey, can I tell you about something that happened a while back that I haven't shared with anyone? Hey, I know I kind of tend to act like I have it all together, but can I be honest about something that I'm struggling with? I'm not fine. Paul's example in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 is a Christian who doesn't just share his faith with other believers, but he shares his soul. Consider some of the metaphors that Paul uses to illustrate the different kinds of relationships that he formed while he was in the city. In verses 11 and 7, he says that he became like a mother and a father to them. In verse 7, he also says that he became like a child. And in verses 1, 14, and 17 of just chapter 2, he calls his audience brothers and sisters. The idea is that Paul related to people in this community in all kinds of ways. It kind of reminds me of his advice to Timothy to treat older men as fathers, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters. The idea is when it comes to sharing our soul, we will do well to pursue a variety of relationships. And the way I want to close tonight is by briefly looking at 3 relationships that are mentioned in chapter 2, and then say one thing about what it can look like to share our soul within those contexts. So this slide is 3 relationships for holy living, and the first relationship that we would do well to have is a relationship with a leader. It's a relationship with a leader. In verse 6 of chapter 1 of this letter, Paul actually recalls when this church imitated his example and his faith. And then in verse 14 of chapter 2, Paul uses the same phrase to describe how the Thessalonians imitated the churches in Judea as it pertains to their suffering. And his idea is you are better because of the examples that you followed. In our lives, who are the people that we can imitate? Who are the people who have been following Jesus longer than us, who are a little further along than us in life or in their spiritual journey? And how are we being intentional about learning from them? According to the Harvard Business Review, people with mentors perform better, advance in their careers faster, and experience more work-life satisfaction. The way Pastor Kenneth would say that in his book, Helping Others Win, is that leaders or mentors, they help us grow and develop into the person that God has designed us to be. In my opinion, this is just in my observation, this is my perspective, I am extremely biased, all of that. So this is worth what it's worth. But in my opinion, young adults who want a mentor are often not aggressive enough when it comes to spending time with a mentor. When I think of all the people who I want to learn from and spend time with, they are busy. And I often feel like I think I'm bugging them, but I want to learn from them so bad. I'm going to, hey, maybe in 3 months, can you give me one Saturday, whatever it looks like? Because more often than not, those of us who want to learn from someone else have to take the initiative in getting time with them. The next relationship that we need for holy living is that of a friend. As I mentioned a moment ago, Paul refers to the people in this church as brothers and sisters 3 times just in chapter 2 alone. And Acts 17, though it is brief, it paints a picture of a group of people who go through adversity together, and they are obviously closer because of what they experience. A friend is someone who we can go through life with, and a friend is someone who we become. Proverbs 13:20 says, walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm. Note that according to the passage, we can suffer not because we're fools, but just because we keep them around. The kind of friend that I'm talking about is someone you can trust and someone who is trustworthy. And then the last relationship that I want to mention from chapter 2 is a relationship with a disciple. A relationship with a disciple. By disciple, I just mean someone who is learning from us. Someone who we are helping to grow into the person that God has created them to be. Paul likens himself to both a mother and a father in verses 8 and 11, and it's in between those metaphors that he uses the phrase, that's when I shared my life with you. When we consider what relationships that we need in order to live whole and healthy, I think that this category of relationships might be one of the easiest to overlook because it's very logical that we should be learning from someone and everyone wants a friend. But God's vision for our life is not that we just become healthy and happy. He also wants us to become helpful. And as we consider the relationships that we give our time to, perhaps there are some people that we often overlook because they don't give a lot to us, but they require stuff from us. And yet the old proverb holds true that whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. Maybe it's a niece or a nephew. Maybe it's a student at Cottonwood Youth. There's a shameless plug. Maybe it's joining a Hope team that serves women who have just left, women who have been rescued from trafficking. Or maybe it's joining a Hope team that serves youth in our foster care system. Or maybe it's just a coworker who's going through a tough season. 3 relationships for holy living, 3 relationships that God will use to shape and sanctify us, and 3 relationships where we have the chance to share our soul. I like to think of them in the form of questions. Who am I learning from? Who am I doing life with? And who am I leading? Ideally, it doesn't happen in every season perfectly, but ideally, we have honest, growing relationships with someone in all of these categories. And as we endeavor to then practice a way of life that involves sharing our soul, I want to leave us with just one more question that we can ask ourselves, particularly as we think through these relationships, or honestly, any relationship where you sense the degree of safety and security that would make this appropriate. Here's the question. Is there something I can say that would help me share my soul? Is there a weakness or a temptation? Is there a struggle that we're embarrassed about? Is there a situation or a circumstance that we're just navigating alone and we haven't let anyone comfort or help us? Is there a success story that we just feel uncomfortable celebrating about ourselves? Is there a part of our life or personality that we have yet to share with others? If there is, then perhaps that is the next step on our journey towards wholeness, because a healthy soul is a shared soul. A couple of questions that we can discuss at our tables. I'll go through them real quick. Number 1 is, what stood out to you from tonight's teaching or tonight's message? Number 2 is, of the relationships that were mentioned, leader, friend, disciple, which one do you tend to overlook the most? Which one gets the least amount of your time in your calendar, the least amount of your emotional and mental energy? And then the last question, what usually stops you from sharing your soul? Now that one I recognize is a little personal, so you feel free to be as vulnerable as you are comfortable with the people at your table. But I put it there because I think there's a way to answer it where we can be reflective while also not being super specific. At the end of the day, we're all going to face our own challenges in this area. Some of us, we just care about what others think way too much. Some of us, we're afraid that we'll be judged. Others of us, we don't really care what people think, but we believe the lie that whatever we're going through or whatever we have to say is just not important enough to bring up. Some of us, we just don't have anyone who we can honestly talk with, or others of us, we've actually been hurt and someone has weaponized our weakness before. Someone has actually exploited our vulnerability. And as a result, this is incredibly difficult for us. No matter what our challenge is, if this is what God is actually inviting us into, if this is his idea of holy living, he will surely make a way. It may be difficult and messy, and there for sure will be trial and error as we figure out, did I say too much? Should I not have said that? Is this person the right person to be telling these things to? But in time, think about how we can actually become people who are secure, people who are both caring and people who are cared for, and people who, like Paul, actually get to share our life with others. And as a result, experience all the benefits and all the freedom and all the joy and all the belonging that comes with. Surely it'll be difficult. But if God's calling us to it, he will make a way.